Here we are, the second and last lecture for this week. I realize that right now I could be standing between you and a giant chicken leg or like a huge thing of stuffing or dressing or mashed potatoes. So I hope that I hope that this lecture actually just increases your hunger for compassion, creativity, and courage too. Like that little segue there. Really bad joke, I know. Anyway, let's talk about an example and what this actually looks like. I've been trying to give you some examples along the way, but I think when we try on different ones, this helps you see what we're doing. Remember when we talk about courage that you have to launch your innovative idea by explaining it, right? So this is, and we've mentioned this before, right? Like when you talk with people about what you're going to do, you can say things like, hey, based on our listening and empathy, what's the one current narrative animating your young people's lives? And then talk about that, right? So you're going to be like, what we've learned as we've talked with young people is that they really believe this. Like a lot of our students talk about this, right? And so we feel like we need to address it, right? And then we say, okay, and then based on our theological reflection, we say, okay, so what's the Jesus-centered narrative you seek to guide them toward or experience? This is when we're like, you know what? This is what they're telling themselves, but the gospel talks about, invites them into a better narrative, right? They're not just going to show up there, but this is where we're going. And this is why we think this is good news for them, right? And so you're giving a chance to kind of talk about the current and the Jesus-centered narratives. And then you're like, hey, based on the work that we've done, this sort of brainstorming and narrowing, which is part of our process, if you were to train with us, I could show you how to do that, and I explain it in the book. What's the practice you think you can get from a current to a Jesus-centered narrative, right? So this is where we're like, okay, so here's what we've listened to. This is like where we think we need to go theologically and just with regards to discipleship. And this is how I think we're going to get there. This is what we're gonna try. This is sort of our approach, right? So you've framed meaning around what you're trying to do. Which it helps explain this to your senior leadership, to parents, to young people, to other people as well. And quite frankly, these are just better conversations. Like I wish like in most like youth ministry conferences, instead of being like, hey, how's your ministry going? Oh man, God is moving. God is moving. Oh man, I'm so thankful. It's really great. It's really great. You know what I mean? Like you know what I'm talking about, right? Like, and I'm always like, what are we talking about right now? Like, are we all just afraid to be honest about like what's really going on? Like, so I just I find that really interesting. Like, what if instead in conferences we're like, you know what, we've been listening to young people and we've been learning this about the way the narratives they talk with themselves, and theologically as we've reflected upon it, we realize that a better Jesus-centered narrative would be this. And so we're trying to figure out like how to scaffold young people to actually be invited into and take seriously Jesus' invitation to this better narrative. This is what we're thinking about. What do you think about that? Like, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? See the difference? Like, it's actually like a real conversation rather than this like, oh man, like things that God is working. I don't have time for that, man. Like, we just need like real conversations. And again, maybe I'm just a little fired up right now because I want you to get to that chicken leg, but that's what I wonder about. So I have a big vision for this. This is more than just like a cute little like formula. I actually think it can change the way we talk with each other about youth ministry. And that seems like kingdom type conversations that I care about. And I think you do as well. So when you think about like launching your innovative idea and explaining it, like you've got all the pieces like in this book that I've written for you, right? Current narrative, Jesus-centered narrative, the practice or the program that you're going to focus on to scaffold that invitation to that Jesus-centered narrative. And then how are we going to implement it? Through the things that I talked to you about before, about what practice is: participatory, ongoing, personal, communal, incremental. And then there's like a dream, like if we do this, this is what I hope will happen. Young people would lives would be different because they've bought into a new narrative that's better for them and better for the world, right? So there's an aspirational piece as well. Like, this stuff will preach, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so let me give you an example. All right, and this one's a little bit different, and this is one that one of our churches did that I thought was quite profound. It certainly pushes the envelope on some things, but I thought I would want to give you just sort of like an aspirational one to see where we go with it, right? So this particular community was in a part of the country where they're a church, but they're very, very close to one of the largest Muslim populations in the United States, right? So their world that they live in is animated by lots of conversations with young people who have friends that come from an Islamic background, right? And hold to a Muslim expression of faith, right? So what that means is, like, for young people, like, this isn't like theory for them. Like, for maybe older generations, like, the thought of a Muslim or something would be way distant. But for a lot of young people in this particular community, it's their friends. Okay, so we begin to see that something is brewing here that these leaders saw that they wanted to address. And so this is what they said. Okay, I'll try to give you these highlights just so that you can see them. Based on our listening and empathy, we speculate that young people feel caught in religious circles that fail to acknowledge the diversity in their community. Okay, as a result, church for young people has become increasingly irrelevant, proclaiming faith that doesn't make sense beyond the church walls. Okay, so they feel like, well, church is fine in church, but like, that's not how I live my life. Okay, so this current narrative leaves young people frustrated that religion seems to invite more division than unity, more pain than healing. Do you feel it? So the listening uncovered, excuse me. So their Jesus-centered narrative then, as they reflected on this, was this: theologically, we know that Jesus makes room for every person, welcoming all into relationship with God. And this narrative reminds Jesus' followers that they are accepted by God, can accept others, and can be accepted themselves. Okay, so this idea of acceptance comes through, right? Young people long to be peacemakers, but often don't know where to start, okay? This narrative encourages them to notice and understand those in their community that likely live differently than their own experiences, okay? So we have the current narrative, the issues that are raised, and like, through this theological reflection, this church said, this is what we want to do about it. We believe this is the vision. We believe that the gospel actually leaves room to actually respond to and work with young people and where they're at to think about this. Now, the practice is to bridge this gap. And so this practice that helps the current narrative is to the Jesus-centered narrative looks like this. And so we want to be led by young adults or young people into the practice of justice. Okay, so that's the practice that they chose. So that our quest for purpose, they want to focus on purpose, identity, belonging, and purpose. We might discover ways Jesus calls us to be the best neighbors to our community and to our relationships. Okay, so how do we show up for other people? What does that look like? And this is what they're going to do. We're going to try a 10-week experiment where young adults, young people, lead us in community bridge building through regularly interacting with a local Muslim community. Okay, so this is a pretty aggressive goal. This particular pastor had relationship with another a Muslim community, so this was possible. So there's a lot of things here that are unique to this particular context, but you can see what they're trying to do, okay? So, and there's something quite developmental about this, right? So here's what they did. All of a sudden they said, well, what does this practice look like? Well, you're going to see a combination of practices and programs, right? Okay, so first of all, they said, well, we want it to be a participatory. So we're going to encourage young people to practice justice through weekly gatherings and individual prompts that invite them to learn the stories of their Muslim neighbors and earn their trust to share their own. Okay, so I want to hear your story. You're going to hear my story. We're going to do that over 10 weeks. So it's not a one-shot thing, but we're also not going to just talk about Christians and Muslim similarities and differences. We're actually going to hear each other's stories. We're going to make this participatory. It's going to be ongoing. Weekly prompts will remind and instruct young people in a way they can practice justice through bridge building over the 10-week period. So these little ongoing reminders are going to help young people with that along the way. We're going to make it personal, right? We envision that young people becoming more comfortable with their justice practice through taking small risks to hear others' perspectives, to share their own stories, and to find a place of commonality, to seek understanding through their differences. Now, notice that this is very, very impersonal. Nobody assumes that everybody's in the same place. Nobody assumes that everybody has the same comfort level. But there's a step toward inviting young people to take a personal step toward this. Now, remember, we're not making them do anything. This is the current narrative that they've heard. This is something that they're concerned about. They just don't necessarily know how to do anything with that current narrative. So the church is actually providing a way for them to address a particular need that they actually have. So this is very personal, right? It's also communal. So in multiple venues, young people will be hosts and guests in gatherings of teaching, meals, dialogue, and worship. Young people will invite other interested friends and church members to join them in their endeavor. So you see what's happening. It's not just about person individually. We're trying to figure out ways, how do we host? How are we guests? And we have ways of doing this back and forth with one another to cultivate this communal experience as well. And then we want to make it incremental. And this particular team came up with this 10-week sort of arc, right? So they have gatherings, and then they have on your own. So I won't read all of this, but you can read this on your own. Gathering one is that an imam teaches about their faith, right? And then on your own, they're gonna read a Muslim American story, right? Like, I'm not even talking with a real person yet. I'm just reading a story. And then in week 2, the imam there's Q&A with them, so we're able to like engage them back and forth, right? And then there's this reading on hospitality in the Bible, right? There's a meal together, and you can see over time. We then move it to we're welcoming Muslims to their community, right? Our own community, and the engagement happens that way. So over time, 10 weeks, this process carefully happens. There's room, there's the communal and personal. A young person can choose how much they want to engage. Some may just want to observe, others may want to participate. But I love this pace because it's intentional. It addresses a current narrative that young people have, and it allows for this to actually happen. Now, I guarantee that this process also required teams to have a lot of conversations, because in some ways, the people that were freaking out were not necessarily young people. It was perhaps their parents that were wondering why a youth group would want to have conversations with Muslims, right? But again, I think what they did is they did a great job to explain, hey, here's where our kids are at. We can ignore this, or we can actually have a conversation. Because through that conversation, these young people are going to understand their neighbor better, but they're going to understand their own Christian faith better as well, right? So this was just a really, really powerful experiment that they did to address the current narrative that was in front of them. So I think you can use this formula for the work that you're going to do. It may not be as extreme as this example that I've given. This is quite it's quite a challenging one, but that's where they were at, and they felt like they needed to go. I think sometimes it can be something that might seem much tamer to maybe this experiment, but really important to you. And that's what it comes down to. We don't necessarily compare what other people are doing. We have to ask ourselves, what are young people talking about? What are they telling themselves? What do they need? What do they want? What's good news to them? And then how do we begin to scaffold something that actually helps them? Because when we do this, we really advocate for young people. And I think then young people will realize that like church and youth ministry is worth it. And we can guilt and shame them to come into youth group. We can take attendance on whether or not they show up at church or not. But I think they're at a time in life where they just want to know, like, is this for real? Does faith work? Does Jesus show up in the spaces where I really need Jesus? Like, what does God ask of me, right? These are the questions of discipleship that I think we all really want, but sometimes we have a hard time knowing how to get there. And there's courage in this, but that's the Christian faith, right? I mean, that's what it's always been about. And I think this is when faith truly comes alive. So just a couple of self questions for you, because I think we can talk about this and think about what we're going to do to young people, or the project we're going to do. But I just want you to maybe reflect on this as you're in like your food coma sometime this weekend. Like, what am I afraid of when it comes to courage? Like, just, tell anybody. I mean, you can tell me if you want to talk about it. But like, what am I afraid of? People? Failing? Something else? I remember one time an older saint, I went to him because I just was struggling, feeling like my work didn't matter. And I think we all go through those periods. And I said to this person, I said, I feel like a failure. I feel like my work doesn't matter. I feel like I'm letting everybody down. And this older saint, I'll never forget it. He looked me square in the eye and he said, "Who's telling you that?" And I realized that no one was telling me that there were faces and voices in my head of people from my past that were the echoes, sort of in the echo chamber of my brain, that were in my mind. They were being disappointed with me. And I realized that sometimes it was just me being my own worst critic. And that set me free, because I ask myself that all the time. Like when I'm really doubting myself, I'm like, who's telling you that? Like, where's that coming from? Is it true? Or is this just something from my past or my insecurities that's building up right now, right? So what am I afraid of? That's a really important question that each one of us need to answer. We can't have courage if we're like haunted by the fears of the past or voices in our head, right? Like sometimes things are scary, don't get me wrong, but like maybe that's just something for you to think about, right? Secondly, what's the next faithful step for me as a leader? Like, what does it mean for you to grow? Like sometimes I think we hold back, not because it's for the kids, but we don't know what the next step is. We're afraid to kind of grow. We're afraid to kind of step out of our wheelhouse or our talents. But I find that oftentimes ministry leaders, especially in youth ministry, like they run on sheer talent, but then there's that point where they have to dig in and be disciplined to continue to grow, right? We all hit those points where raw talent runs out and discipline steps in. So what's the next faithful step for you? Third, where might be a next faithful step I want to call my ministry toward, right? I think we could think about our ministries as well. Like, where do we need to go? Like, have we lulled into like the yearly schedule, or it's kind of like rote, right? Automatic. Like, what do we need to disrupt, change because of what young people need? What do we need to think about? And then this is a really important question, okay? And I really want you to think about this. Like, when will I begin any of these things that we just talked about? I find that a lot of youth leaders that I've talked with over the last couple of years, they're always like, wow, Steve, this is great. So great. I want to do this. I'm like, great. They're like, I just don't have time right now. So when my schedule clears up, when I have more space, that's when I'm really going to go after that. I promise, Steve, I'm going to go after it. And I in a very compassionate way, say to them, like, are you in ministry? Like, can you ever tell me a time when like your schedule is free? When people stop needing you? When the world is like, okay, everybody, everything's fine. Like, my friends, that is never going to happen. There's always going to be things to do. And so the question is of whether or not we are going to be reactive leaders or proactive leaders. If we are going to be people that run around always putting out fires and making excuses about when we're going to do time to really do what we want to do, or when we are going to heed God's call to say, God has called me to this space to not just be a program director, but to be a pastor of the people that leads the people where they need to go. I believe that's who you are. I believe that's why you're in the role that you're in. I believe that's why you are in seminary. And so I want you to have the courage to not wait for that perfect time, but to make the time. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I'm with you. Like, if you try something and it blows up and you're like, I'm trying to do it and I don't know what to do, call me. We'll chat about it. That's totally fine. But for the sake of the kingdom and for the sake of young people, do not wait for the perfect moment. Make the moments, because I think that's what God has called you to. Okay. So I just want you to know that that's what this process is all about. I like you, I think really want our work to matter, and I want to cheer you on in that way. So my friends, may you know courage. May you have the courage to face the voices in your head, the challenges in front of you, the steps you need to take to grow as a leader. May you make the space to do what you know God is calling you to do on behalf of young people as you invite them into a better, more beautiful, Jesus-centered narrative. And along that way, may you be messed up for the glory of God, and may you know God's grace and peace.